My guest today on Creative Inspired Happy is Eowyn Ivey, Pulitzer Prize finalist and UK National Book Award winner for her novel The Snow Child. Her latest book, Black Woods, Blue Sky, is out now. Today, we talk about how her experience as a bookseller and a journalist helped when she began to tackle writing a novel, whether the Pulitzer nomination put pressure on her for her next book, transforming painful personal experience into beautiful, impactful fiction, accepting rejection as part of the process of being a writer, and so much more. Creative Inspired Happy is a video podcast about incredibly successful writers and others in the book world and how they rose out of obscurity to build fulfilling careers, hosted by me, New York Times bestselling author Evelyn Skye. To join our community and get more writing advice, creativity challenges, the opportunity to ask questions of upcoming podcast guests, and more, follow the link in the episode notes. I hope you enjoy the show. Hey, Eowyn, welcome to Creative Inspired Happy. Thank you for being on. How are you?
Good. Thank you so much for having me, Evelyn. I'm really looking forward to talking to you today.
Well, everyone in the community was just so excited to have you on the show. And so I will have some questions for them today as well. But I would love to get started first by talking about how did you enter the world of books? Were you a big reader as a child, or did you write as a kid?
Yeah, that's a great question. I feel like it's like as long as my memory life is there, books are a part of it. And that was partly just because both my parents were avid readers. My mom was a poet. She was a Tolkien fan, which you might, if you know enough about Tolkien, you know from my name. She named me after one of the characters. So I feel like it's almost in my genes in a way. And I don't really ever remember a time that I wasn't either being read to or reading on my own. And I loved to write as a little kid. I would invent little stories, but I will say that I never really imagined that I could be a writer for a living. That just never occurred to me. So it was kind of like I knew it would always be a part of my life in one form or another. But this has been a dream how it's all unfolded.
Yeah, I actually came to it similarly. It never occurred to me, as you put it, that you could be a writer as your actual job, and that somehow these books must have been magically appearing somehow into my life, right?
Exactly.
I think that actually leads us perfectly into Creative Inspired Happy is not just a podcast, we're also a community online of writers. And before every show, I let our community know who's coming up on my recording schedule, and they get the opportunity to pose some questions, and I choose a couple. So Priscilla E. has a question for you, and it is: stepping into the world of authorship must have been such a thrilling experience. Can you tell us your mindset on how you went from a bookseller and journalist to an author? And I would love to maybe have you embellish a little bit. Just tell us about what it was like as a bookseller and as a journalist.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I had worked, when I was in college, I started out as an English literature major, but I realized that I didn't want to teach for a living. I just don't have that. That's just not a part of my my skill level, I think. And so I was trying to figure out how am I going to make a living being in that world of reading and writing. And that's how I ended up going into journalism. So I worked for almost 10 years as a newspaper reporter, just at our local small town newspaper. And it was really a great experience because even though I wasn't getting to write the kind of things I love to read and that I wanted to eventually write, it was getting me into the habit of just producing copy, just being able to put words together quickly and be edited and be open to criticism of my writing. And I feel like all of that was really, I'd like to say it was all a grand plan. Like all along, I knew that I was putting these skills in place for down the road, but it wasn't like that. It was like, how can I make a living as a writer right now? Let's do this. And, but at a certain point, I kind of realized that I wasn't doing the kind of writing that I wanted to, that I was spending my free time reading novels, in love with fiction. And I thought, how can I make the mental space to do that kind of writing? Because when you're working at a newspaper, by the end of the day, all my creative energy was gone. And so that was when I went and switched to working at a bookstore. And again, it was not a grand plan, but it was the perfect thing for me because suddenly I was surrounded just by people who love books, talking about books, getting exposed to authors I'd never heard of, beginning to understand a little bit about how the publishing world worked, at least from the bookseller standpoint. And then that's where I found my inspiration for my first story. So it really all kind of led me down. I kept kind of following my heart, and it led me the right direction, I think, ultimately.
And then what was it like finally? Like, when did you make that leap to decide that you were going to write a novel? Which, and also, I guess the next question, part of that question is, was that novel The Snow Child, or was it something else
Yeah,
that
this
we
is a
haven't seen, that wasn't
yeah,
published?
yeah, this is a great question too, because yeah, so right when I went to work at the bookstore, that was the plan. I was going to work part-time at the bookstore and then have some free time, hopefully to write, start working on fiction. And so right away I started working on fiction. And I started a novel that I would describe as kind of modern realism set in Alaska. And I worked really, really hard on it, but I was not in love with it. I knew something wasn't working. I was bored with it, but I didn't know how to fix it. And then it was when I found the little fairy tale, the children's paperback book that inspired The Snow Child, that kind of set me down that path. So that first novel, in ways, it's a little heartbreaking, as I'm sure all of you in the writing community will understand. It's like when you work for years on something and then realize that you need to abandon it. On one hand, it feels like such a waste. But again, just like the time as working as a newspaper reporter, it all was my learning process and figuring out what I wanted to do and how to start crafting scenes and things. So that was sort of my practice run that will never see the light of day, and that's okay.
So actually, this dovetails beautifully with Rima Kay's question, which is, how did your work as a journalist inform your practice as a fiction writer, especially when you were working on both that first manuscript and then what eventually became The Snow Child? And then my twist on that is, was there anything about being a journalist that actually hurt you think, as a fiction writer?
Yeah. So again, I think just the amount of writing that I did, just the sheer amount of putting words together was really helpful. And I think too, kind of starting to get this feeling of what subjects I was drawn to. I would write columns for the outdoors section about my hiking trips or my fishing trips. And that was where I felt like I was beginning to kind of touch on the subjects that meant a lot to me. So that helped me. I think the hardest thing about switching then from being a newspaper reporter is I felt like I could call anyone and say, hey, I'm a reporter with the Frontiersman. I've got some questions for you. And it felt like a very valid, legitimate thing to do. But as a fiction writer, I still wanted to do this kind of research. I wanted to get my facts right. I wanted to speak with people who were, had the information I needed. But I felt really silly calling and saying, I'm working on a novel and I'm wondering if I can interview you. And for some reason, it just didn't feel like a real job. And sometimes I still feel a little that way. I'm not sure why. I think it's just because it's so much, in ways, it's so much fun, and it doesn't feel like a 9 to 5 normal job. So I think that was the strangest adjustment, going from writing as a newspaper reporter versus writing fiction.
Yeah, I get that. I think that, like, I've had my friends say that they will reach out to people, professors or whatever experts that they need to talk to, and say, hey, I'm working on a book. And I wonder sometimes how they get people to respond from them, because uh, there's so many people who want to write a story, right? And like, how does this, let's say a professor on like whatever subject, how do they decide that you're actually like really working on something versus like, oh, I've just got this idea that I'm sort of, going to forget about in 2 weeks, right? Like, because their time is so valuable. I
Exactly.
mean,
And
have you found a solution?
well, what's funny is, and I will say too, that I always, you would kind of think, like, definitely when I was writing The Snow Child, like, I had no published fiction, so I had nothing to even authenticate that I'm a novel writer. But the funny thing is now, I have a few books out, and a lot of people still, like, I think sometimes you can start to feel like you're somewhat known within a small community, but the vast majority of people don't read novels, and so they still don't know who I am, and that's okay. But what I found, and it is true that I found this as a newspaper reporter too, is if you're respectful and you genuinely want to know someone's background or experience, and you're valuing that, I find that most people are really happy to talk with you, even if they think maybe you're never going to actually write anything. I think most people enjoy having a conversation about what's important to them. And I've just been really fortunate over the years of having people who are more than willing to have me tag along on something or do, I'm incredibly grateful for that. And I always just try to be very respectful and give people the room to say no if it's not something they're comfortable doing, just saying that's okay, and do you have someone else that you can recommend or something like that? Yeah.
I think it's actually really helpful. I really love that perspective of you're giving them space, to talk about something that they're passionate about, right? And I'm not saying that from like an entitled point of view, but I'm saying like, we find writing, like this is our passion. And I would talk about writing forever. I'll talk
Exactly.
to like a tree about writing. And if you approach that respectfully, saying, hey, this is your field of expertise, this is this thing you love, and I'm so curious, would you be willing to share?
Yeah.
That's a wonderful, wonderful approach.
Yeah. And it's a lot of
Um,
fun. I mean, I think I love being able to, like, that's what I feel like one of the fun things about being a fiction writer is I get a chance to step into all these different lives that are entirely different than mine. And I don't have to, I don't have to be a field biologist forever. I can just write about it for a little bit, and that's fun.
Tell me about your process. So you've talked a little bit about how you reach out to experts to do your research, but in general, how do you write? And I know that, so for those who are watching or listening and don't realize you are in Alaska, because I forgot to say that at the top, you're in Alaska, right? And that has informed your writing in many
Mhm.
ways. What other things do you do, or how do you get into the mode of writing?
Yeah, it's something that I really struggle with sometimes in terms of getting into kind of that what some people call like a flow state or getting into the mental space of being a writer. I sometimes find very difficult. So I have tried just about everything under the sun. Behind me I have a whole stack of books that are, writers guides to writers routines and what writers have done. I'm always curious. I love reading biographies of writers. I love seeing what people do because I find that at different times in my life, depending on what's going on, where I am, what's happening with my family and things, I have to adjust and I have to try different things. So it was very different when I was writing The Snow Child, when we had a brand new baby. I was pregnant and then had a brand new baby, and we had our young daughter. So that time in my life was and I was working part-time. My husband was working full-time. So I had to do different things then. Whereas now, I have the complete luxury of basically devoting my time to being a writer, but that has its own challenges because you suddenly have all this time that you can just sort of piddle away and not get things done. So I've tried everything from like, I have to write 500 words a day, or, if I write every single day, then on Friday I can go to my favorite coffee shop and bring my laptop and have a scone while I write, little rewards or little, just about anything I've tried. And I just always, my feeling is just, I just keep trying things until something works. And then I stick with that for as long as I can.
Yeah, I really think that that resonates with me, that every writer has to find what works for them. But I think your point as well, that you have to adjust, that your life changes. And so the things that worked in the past might not be the right thing for this situation now. And I think that that is such a helpful tip. I'm curious
Yeah.
what kind of writer you are in terms of, are you a fast drafter? Do you hate the rough draft and you want to get through it? Or do you want to luxuriate in the words? Do you want to make sure your sentences are perfect, like when you lay them down, and therefore you write slower? What are you like as a writer?
Yeah, I'm a very slow writer, and I think you exactly stated it, which is that I get the most pleasure oftentimes on the word by word level. So if I'm just kind of I envy in a lot of ways writers who are like, just get a crappy first draft done, just write it really fast, and then you've got this material to work with. And I feel like I want to try that sometime, but it goes so much against me because I get the thrill, sort of the adrenaline rush from having a paragraph or a sentence just feel so right. But what's so stupid about this approach is that, like, oftentimes I'm ripping out entire chapters, 6 months down the road that I have spent all this time fiddling with. And so I don't think I don't recommend it. I don't think it's the most effective way of doing it, but it's just the way that I do it and the way that I guess I can keep going because I feel satisfied with these little bits that I've done. And I have to kind of force out of my mind the fact that I know that some of it's going to get cut or completely reworked. It's like I can't let myself think about that. I have to think, this is it. This is how it's going to be in print if it ever makes it to print.
I think that's a myth that we have to tell ourselves anyway, just to write books, because otherwise the entire process is so overwhelming, right? To try to hold an entire finished book in your mind when you have nothing on the page yet, it's actually too much. And so like I try to approach it kind of like, you know what, I'm going to sit down and do my work for today, which might
Yeah.
be like one scene or one chapter, even though I know that I have to do so many of those to
I
finish an
know.
entire book, and then revise them. And like you said, throw things out and rewrite them. And why am I wasting my time writing this thing if it's just going to be gone anyway? But it's part of the process, right? Like that's how
It
you
is.
get from point A to point Z.
Yeah. And
You
so
know, I'm
often. Oh, good. I was gonna say, so often I find too, and I don't know if it's the same with you, where I'm discovering things during that process. Even if that specific chapter doesn't end up working, I've learned something about the character or something that's really vital. So but it's daunting if you think of it as a big, and it makes me think of Anne Lamott. Is it Anne Lamott's Bird by Bird, which is that idea, taking a bird at a time?
Yeah, it's actually so great that you mentioned that because we have a book club on Creative Inspired Happy, and Bird by Bird is our March read. And
Oh,
so we will be taking that and dissecting it and seeing kind of like how that, not only how she wrote the book, right, but then also, how that works for each of us as
yeah.
writers at different phases of our careers. But it's, I love what you said about discovering your story and your characters as you're writing, because I outline. I mean, I might be the total opposite of you. I'm a finisher, so I fast draft. I'm so uncomfortable with not having enough pages or words to be a book, even if they're terrible. So I need to finish something to be like, okay, I can do this. But I still find this thrill as I'm, 2/3 into the book and I realize, oh, I got this character wrong in this outline, or like, this is not the way the story goes. And then I go back and I can change something. And so in that moment, I'm not sad that I've written something and I have to throw it out. It's part of this like wow moment. And I don't know if you feel this way. Sometimes I feel like these stories and these people exist already in the world, in the universe somewhere. And I'm discovering them. And when I get them right, I feel like, ooh, look what I found.
Yeah, absolutely. That is part of the thrill. And that's when revision, I think, is so fun. When you've discovered something. And sometimes what's interesting to me, and I don't know if you found this too, sometimes it's something small that you can actually very easily weave back through what you've already written and put it in little pieces in there. And I really, and my mom, she was a poet, and she would always say this. She'd say, I'm not that great of a writer. I'm just a really good reviser. And I kind of feel like there's something to that. Like if you can really engage in the revision process, I think that's where it gets elevated to another level. And that's when it gets very exciting, I think.
Oh, I love that. I love that so much. Okay. So I have a question for you from Diana W. And this is about being a Pulitzer finalist. And she asks, were there any unintended consequences resulting from being a Pulitzer finalist, like future performance anxiety?
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, it was just an amazing, completely mind-boggling thing to have happen. And I think mostly what it's done is just opened up so many opportunities for me. I think that my work gets a second glance. If I'm submitting to an editor, it just opened doors for me that I could never have imagined would have been possible in my life. And it's interesting because when I wrote The Snow Child, my first book, is the one that was a finalist for the Pulitzer, and then I wrote my second book. It was almost like the opposite feeling. I kind of felt like I could rest on my laurels. Like, okay, I had one that did really great and had all this stuff happen. So now I can just have fun and write, and like, it's okay if it's not a Pulitzer finalist. Like, it kind of took some of the pressure off in a weird way. But strangely, with the new book, I have felt anxiety pressure. And I think it's just because it's so personal to me. It's so close to my heart. And I think that was an unexpected anxiety that I hadn't ever felt before with my writing. So that's been different. But that really didn't have anything to do with past success. I think it's just more how important the book is to me.
Okay, so let's talk about that book. So I have it. If you're watching this interview, it's Black Woods, Blue Sky. Tell us about what this book is about.
Yeah, so it's a story about a young single mother who has a 6-year-old little girl named Emmeline, and it's set in Alaska. And like both of my earlier books, if you've read one of my books, you kind of have an expectation it's going to be set in Alaska, and there's going to be some fantastical surprises to it. And that's very true with this one. And if you look at the cover, it kind of gives you an inkling of what happens. So the single mother falls in love with a man who lives out in the woods on the far side of this river in a very remote area. And in the cover, I love the cover art on this. But what they did is if you have a copy, you can look at it. There's a bear standing next to a tree, and then his shadow is a man. So that kind of gives you an idea where it's going. And it's set in a more modern time than my other novels. It's set in like roughly the 80s or 90s, but I've left it a little bit vague on that side. And so it's about the kind of the heartbreak and the wonder that comes to this little family.
Okay, I want to read one of the blurbs in the back from Louise Erdrich. Black Woods, Blue Sky is a fable about what it is to love, a tale of longing, a call to renew our deepest bonds with the living world. It will draw you along like a fast moving stream, and you will find yourself in places you have never been. just, oh, that gave me chills. What a
Oh.
gorgeous, gorgeous blurb. Um, Talk to me a little bit, if you're willing to, about like why this was such a personal story.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, so this is the first time I've ever had a character that I would say is very autobiographical, is definitely inspired by my own feelings. And that's the little girl, Emmeline, the 6-year-old little girl in the story. And I feel like into her, I was kind of able to pour all the really kind of magical memories from my childhood, but also some of my fears. I was very close to my dad. I loved him very much. He was a very important figure in my life. Like I said before, an avid reader. We would talk about books. He was a big fan of my work and read it. But he was also a very, very violent person. And I had very terrifying times in my childhood. So I always knew that I wanted to write about this somehow, to kind of capture this cognitive dissonance of having someone that you know loves you, but is also very dangerous to you. And so that's really the heart of the novel, I think. I think this is, in many ways, this is Emmeline's story. It's the story of how she becomes who she is and what her roots are, and kind of coming to terms with some of those things. But it does make you
Mm.
more vulnerable. I think the closer something is to your heart, it's scarier to put it out in the world a little bit.
It is. And I've had to do that with some of my books, like one of my books in particular. So this one behind me, The 100 Loves with Julie, it was very personal. And I remember when we went on submission to different editors, there were some who were like, oh, this is great. We'll just like publish it like this as a love story. And then I had one editor who said, like, I see the personal truth in this story. I think we could make this book extraordinary, but you are going to have to be willing to be really raw and dig in deep. And I don't want to force you to do that if you don't want to. But if you say yes, that's the journey we're going to go on. And I think that it was so illuminating to me, as a, just for me personally as a person, but also, I don't know if you feel this way. Sometimes it's easier for me to put things that I'm feeling, emotions, or, like conflicts, into other characters, and I
Mhm.
let them carry the burden for me. So I'm not a memoir kind of person. I don't think I will ever write a memoir, but I will absolutely give things to my characters. Is that, you're nodding? Yes. Is that kind of
Absolutely. Yes.
similar?
You've just completely captured the whole experience. And I don't know about you, but to me, it feels like taking something that's, troubling, or that you're struggling with, and you're processing it. Through that processing it, it's a kind of letting go. It's a way of sort of, I mean, and I don't mean to sound pretentious on behalf of all of us writers, but you hope that you're turning it into art. You're turning it into something that's bigger and more than this small, difficult thing that you've gone through. And I feel like that's a really powerful. And I really like what you said too about your editor, because I was so fortunate enough. This book took me a long time to write. And I think it's exactly what you're talking about, where I was afraid to get too close to the genuine, the real heart of the matter. And I was sort of circling it and trying to dodge it in some way. And both my US and my UK editors, Marianne Harrington and Andrea Walker, were both so wonderful to just give me the time. They kept saying, you're not there yet, and they couldn't tell me how to do it. They could only tell me that I needed to keep going. And that's what I did. And it was a big process. And I'm grateful, because I don't know that everyone gets that time, or that editor like you had that says, there's more here, let's dig deeper. And I'm so grateful for those people in the world that can help us writers make those leaps.
Yeah, absolutely. Suzanne H has a question for you, which I think is related to this. So there's this saying that truth is stranger than fiction. And so her question was, if you believe that that's true, how did that weave itself into the canvas of your story? And, knowing now, right, how personal this story was, how did that, is that true for you?
Yeah, it's so interesting. I'm kicking myself that I think it's in Geraldine Brooks's new book, Memorial Days. I'm reading it right now. It's a memoir. And in it, I'm pretty sure that's in there, that she has this line, something about to the fact that sometimes when you're trying to write nonfiction, when you put the words on the page, you feel like you're getting farther away from the truth. And with fiction,
Mm.
you start putting the words on the page, you start getting closer to the truth. And there is something about that. I think trying to speak in metaphors and capture kind of the very essence of something, rather than sort of the nitty gritty details of a very specific circumstance, transforming it into something metaphorical, I think does get closer at truth, hopefully with like a capital T kind of truth, right? That's maybe, perhaps you hope, more universal. And like you, I've never had any interest in writing a memoir. I don't particularly find the details of my troubled childhood particularly interesting. Whereas I find if I can turn it into something that's more thrilling and magical like that. I love that feeling.
No, I think that's wonderful. To kind of shift gears a little bit to something maybe a little lighter and business or oriented, I'm curious about working with UK and US editors simultaneously, it sounds like. How does that process work? Because for me, it's always been that I write a book for my US editors and then it is sent off to, wherever UK or wherever else we're doing translations, and they just get this book that I wrote and they do, the translations, or, in terms of UK market, maybe they change some spellings so
Yeah.
it's more British.
Right. Yeah, no, it was a really kind of an interesting experience with the Snow Child because I don't know that it was typical. Where I think some of the biggest interest early on, before it sold to Little Brown, to my editor at Little Brown, some of the biggest interest was actually from foreign publishers, and the UK was one of the biggest ones. They just Marianne Harrington, my editor there, just was so supportive and so enthusiastic about the Snow Child. So right away when she purchased it and Little Brown through Andrea Walker purchased it, they teamed up together with that first book. So from the very beginning, I've had this kind of team approach. Now, in general, I mostly communicate with my US editor early on, but then always Marianne would be looped in and we would kind of look at it all together. And I feel so fortunate because I don't know about you and other writers, but finding people whose opinion you trust and you have faith in is really hard. And there's so many people that you should absolutely not listen to. And to find that I've got two people plus my agent, Jeff, who's also a wonderful editor, Jeff Kleinman, the three of them, I just really trust their judgment and I can kind of incorporate. And I know that if all three of them are saying something, there's something to it that I really need to pay attention to. So it's been really just an amazing gift to have all three of them.
I think it's really amazing that your books resonate so much with readers both here in the US and in the UK, because I have found that there are a lot of books that are one or the other, because even though people are big readers, even though we all speak English, the cultures are still different, right? And the things that draw readers to books are different. And so what is often a huge success here is not necessarily across the pond. And yet you won the UK National Book Award, I believe, right, for The Snow Child.
Yeah.
But then you were also a Pulitzer finalist here. So what do you think it is about your books, or maybe if you don't want to talk about your books, just in general, that is broad enough to appeal to both audiences?
I have absolutely no idea. Like it feels like some kind of, I mean, really, it's completely mind boggling to me, because with the Snow Child, and I will say that's mostly true of the Snow Child. I don't think my second books are quite as, I don't know. They don't, I mean, they do have appeal, but I think the Snow Child was like an exceptionally crazy situation to have a book, and even in other languages to do well in Norway and South America. I mean, it's just, I don't understand it. I'm not sure. And I don't know if it has something to do with sort of that fairy tale universal quality that maybe lets people in. And I will say too, that I think I lucked out in terms of the fact that was, especially when the Snow Child came out, there was a huge surge of interest in Alaska. And that was nothing to do with anything I did. Like that was just that I live here. I'm going to write about it. That was pure luck on I mean, I think when it came out in the UK, I don't know if it was the BBC, one of their big TV shows all about the Arctic that people were in love with, So sometimes I think as writers, as unfair or whatever as it is, sometimes we luck out just with timing or where there's a certain interest level in some subject or place that we benefit from. And all you can do is say, thank you. Who knows why it happens sometimes.
Do you think that you're a different writer now from The Snow Child and then, into to now to Black Woods, Blue Sky? And how do you think you've changed or grown or gotten worse, if you think you've gotten
Yeah,
worse?
yeah. No, I think that's a really great question. I mean, I think that if anything, I've gotten braver. There's no way that I could have written Blackwoods Blue Sky when I was, in my 30s. I just don't think that I had processed things enough in my life, and I don't think I had the courage to do it at that point. So I think that's one way that I've changed. And I think I mean, I don't know that I've grown, but I've had fun. In terms of like my second book, I wrote it all more in an epistolary style. So it's letters and journals and diaries. This one's in a more modern voice. And I've had fun with it. I don't know that it's made me a better writer or a worse writer, but I've just enjoyed getting to kind of explore and try different things, try different voices. It's been really fun.
Is that something that you push yourself to do, is take on different narrative challenges, or does it happen just organically as a story develops?
I just think I'm drawn to it as a reader as well. I don't tend to read series of books. I don't tend to, a lot of times I won't even if I find a book by one author that I like, I don't necessarily go then and read all of their books. I love just experiencing, and it's kind of hard to describe. It's almost like the texture of the book, the texture of the language and the way it's written. I just love exploring different ways that people communicate ideas and paint a picture in your head. So for me, it's, I guess, partly what really draws me to it. And if I had been told, like, okay, you can only write more books like The Snow Child, I wouldn't have done it, because I don't have any interest in writing more books like that. I want to try new things. And I don't know that, again, I don't know that that serves me well in terms of, developing a readership or not. I think that sometimes people want something that feels familiar, similar to what they read that they liked that you wrote before. But that's just, I get bored and I want to try something new.
I mean, I like the resistance to branding. And I mean, as someone who's studied the business of publishing so much, like I understand branding, I've done it. And then I've also gotten bored and decided, actually, I want to write something else. Right. And so I kind of write whatever I want. And I think that what I have heard from my readers, though, is that no matter what genre I'm writing or whatever style I'm doing, there's still a through line. And that is me as a writer. And maybe it is, as you said, the texture of language, right? It is the thing that is Eowyn.
Hmm. No, I think you are right. Like, and that's a lovely thought, to think that readers are seeing something of you that's a through, like you say, a through line through your books. I mean, what a wonderful, wonderful thing. And I mean, and the truth is, in ways, it's branded not intentionally. My books are all set in Alaska. So far, they all have some magical realism elements. But I agree. I think sometimes you just have to follow your heart as a writer, because I think if you, at least my experience, both as a bookseller and talking to other writers, I think sometimes if you try to chase bestsellerdom, or you try to chase the market, it just does, it's just an impossible challenge. Like, things change so fast and you don't know what's going to be popular tomorrow or the next day. So you might as well write something that you're enjoying writing, because no matter what, at least you've done that, and that's something.
Yeah. Okay. So I have a question for you in terms of advice for other writers. And I would love if you have advice for writers who are starting out, who are not yet published. Let's say they're aspiring authors, and they are, of course, already writers, but maybe aspiring published authors. And then also advice for writers who are further down the line. Maybe they have a few books already published. And what have you learned, or what would you say to your past self? What would you say to yourself now?
I guess the biggest thing, and maybe it's kind of obvious, but like, rejection is so much a part of the process. I think that so often, when you look at someone's career, like an author that you admire, you only see the successes. I mean, that's just the reality. You see the books they've gotten published, the awards they've won. And I think sometimes as writers, we're tempted to make it seem as if, like, oh, I hardly do any editing at all. It all just comes so naturally. But that's just not, from my own experience and from people I know, it is hard work, and you're going to get rejected. And that does not mean you're not going to someday get published. And if one book gets rejected, it's okay to set it aside and start something new. That was one of the best pieces of advice my agent Jeff gave me when The Snow Child, he was first taking it out, and there didn't seem to be interest among U.S. publishers at first, early on. And he said, you know what, let me handle this. Just start working on the next thing. And I think that's great advice. If you start to sending out, your query letters to agents, or your book is on submission, start thinking about your next story, because then you're invested in something. Even if this one doesn't work, you think, well, that's okay. I've got something even better now. And not to feel discouraged by rejection, because we all go through it. I guarantee it.
And then what would you say to people who are maybe like you, already a few books published, but looking towards that next step in their career?
I don't know. I would like some advice from people in that. I mean, honestly, I guess I feel like I'm always looking to other people to kind of see, like, okay, now what? How do you handle this situation? And again, I guess I'm just taking each book as it comes, and I'm trying to remain humble, and keep learning, and not assume that I have it figured out, because things just keep changing. Both in terms of the market, what people are interested in. I just try to read a lot too, because I feel like it's not really that healthy for me to keep my focus constantly on, like, is this book succeeding or not succeeding? I am much happier when I'm reading new things by other people and being inspired by what they're doing. So I don't know if that's advice, but it's been my coping mechanism, is to not always worry about me and my books, but to also try to lift up other writers, see what they're doing, try to learn from other writers along the way.
I think that's fantastic. So then for you at this juncture in your career, you've got a great third novel out. You're either starting to write something or you're thinking about it. What are you most looking forward to next for yourself, for you and your writing?
I have to confess, and I've said this a lot, but it really is true. Right about this part in the process with each book, I have said I'm not doing that again. I just, I really have. I don't know if it's just the way I write or how much I feel I invest. I just feel like I pour everything I have into that book, and I feel kind of empty and drained. And then when I'm in this phase of the process where I'm trying to post more on social media, I'm engaging, which I love engaging with readers and booksellers and librarians. It just feels like a very different kind of job at this point, and I don't have the mental capacity much to start. But saying all this, and my family laughs at me because I do say this every time, but then, I'll be out for a walk or something and I'll come back and I'll say, so I kind of have this little idea. What do you guys think? So it seems to come on me kind of against my will. I think probably, hopefully something will come along someday, but I also try to let it be. It's okay if I don't write another book. It really is. It's not the only thing that I can do to earn a living or the only thing that makes me happy in life. So I just kind of let it come as it comes.
That's such an incredibly healthy attitude. I think that a lot of writers, they put their entire identity into being a quote unquote writer. And so there's almost too much pressure on this act of creativity, this beautiful act of creating art. And when you give it space to come when it's ready and when you can form something worthwhile, then maybe that's why it appears in that moment.
Yeah. Well, and I just think too,
Speaking
I was going to say really quick too, I was just going to say that like, if you've written a book, like if you have a completed manuscript, like it's okay to just be like, wow, I feel like there's always this next phase of reaching, right? Like, oh, I need to publish another book. I need to get higher on this list or whatever. And to just celebrate what you have done, because even just finishing a manuscript is just an amazing accomplishment.
Completely agree. So my husband, Tom, he is so good at small celebrations and he has taught me this skill, right? So if I finish a zero draft, he'll say, we should have cake. And then I finish the first draft, which I feel like is not a big deal. Because like for me, between zero draft and first draft, it's not that big of a phase because zero draft was just, like I said, fast draft, make the thing ugly and just get it out there. And then I fix it up a little bit. But then he's just like, we should have cake again.
Oh, that's
but
wonderful.
It's great, right?
That's wonderful.
Yeah. Okay, so you'd mentioned being on social media, connecting with readers, other writers. Where can people find you online? And I will also include this in the episode notes. So if anyone's looking for you, they can just click on a link.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I feel like I'm on everything and trying to figure out which ones work best for me. So I'm on Facebook. I have probably my most active following on Facebook, just under Eowyn Ivey. And I got onto Instagram recently. My editor encouraged me to do it. And actually, I've really been enjoying that. That's been a new thing for me. So I'm on there. I'm kind of on X still, but it's just because I had a weird situation where someone was impersonating me on there. So I had to have a thing on there, which was very strange. But I'm also on Blue Sky. So that's a new one for me that I'm kind of messing around with. So you can find me a lot of places. And I hope people find me and connect with me. That'd be great.
Fantastic. Well, I can't wait for everybody to read your book. I can't wait to read it because I just got this from your publicist the other day. So Blackwoods, Blue Sky, everyone. Thank you so much for being on the show, Eowyn. This has been so fun.
Thank you, Evelyn. Wonderful questions. It's always so fun to get to talk with another writer. I really appreciate it.
Want more writing advice and career insight? Join thousands for free at creativeinspiredhappy.com to go behind the scenes with best-selling authors and get access to our book club for writers, creativity challenges, and more. I can't wait to see you there.